Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hi everyone, welcome to lecture number 30, the second lecture on wage structure. In our last lecture, we discussed about wage structure and the wage distribution in the economy, how it is positively skewed, and we discussed about different measures, different indexes to measure this inequality in the economy. Many studies have attempted to document these historic changes in the wage structure across the countries. What it has been observed is that the dispersion in the wage distribution increased substantially in last 20-30 years of time. This wage gap between the top of the wage distribution and those are at the bottom, it has widened dramatically. Further, this wage differential has widened among the educational groups, among the skilled and unskilled workers, among the experienced groups, and also among the age groups, young and old. So, the wage differentials are widened within the socio-economic and demographic characteristics, which means the wages of the workers of the same education, age, sex, occupation and industry were much more dispersed. In this lecture, we will discuss about why did this inequality has increased over the period. Wage inequality has increased because of several reasons, like the technological advancement. The production process has changed, the technology has taken space and at much faster rate. So, the technological progress has led to increased demand for highly skilled workers who can leverage technology efficiency and most effectively, while reducing the demand for low skills, widen the gap between high and low skilled workers, which contributes to the wage inequality. Another factor we had already discussed in our earlier lecture, globalization. This globalization has intensified the competition in the labor market, leading to outsourcing these low skilled jobs to the countries with the low labor cost. Now, you can see most of the productions have been outsourced to these countries like Bangladesh, China, where there is the cost of the labor is low. So, this has put forward a pressure on the wages for the low skilled workers in the developed countries, showing some wage inequalities. Institutions in the labor market over the period of time in a globalized world has become little bit not of that much powerful, and also they have declined. In the market driven economy, there is a decline in the unionization. The decline in the union membership and the bargaining power has weakened the ability of the worker to negotiate with the high wages and the benefits with the employer. So, as a result, the wages for the unionized workers who tends to earn higher wages than non-unionized workers have stagnated or declined relatively to this non-unionized workers, and this has widened the wage inequality over the period of time. Further, because of this technological advancement, changes in the nature of the product market, the globalization, it has changed the labor market institutions across the globe. Changes in the labor market institutions like minimum wage policies, collective bargaining agreements and employment protection laws have also contributed to this wage inequality. For example, let us say this erosion of this minimum wage value in real terms over time has disproportionately affected the low wage workers, leading to widening wage differentials. Further, education and skill. There has been a growing demand for the workers with a higher level of education and specialized skills in the sectors such as technology, finance, healthcare. So, this has resulted a higher wage premium for the individuals with the college degrees or technical certifications, which has widened the wage gap between high and low skilled workers over the period of time in the economy. Further, changes in the corporate governance and compensation practices. So, executive compensation practices including stock points, bonus, performance based pay, these kind of incentives have become increasingly more skewed towards the top executives and senior managements, moving towards a new different kind of social security after retirement. So, this has contributed to widen wage differential between the executive and the rank and the file workers within the companies. Further, tax policies. Changes in the income tax policies including reduction in the top marginal tax rates and the preferential treatment of the capital gain and the dividends have benefited these high income individuals, which has amplified this wage inequality problem in the economy. So, these are the factors among others have contributed to increase in the wage inequality, which is observed in many countries across the globe over few decades. So, addressing wage inequality often requires a comprehensive policy intervention targeting education and skill development, labor market regulations, tax policies and social safety nets together. So, as we have already discussed, no single factor seems to be able to explain all or even most of the changes in the wage structure. Instead, the concurrent changes in the economic fundamentals and labor market institutions in the economy. Now, to explain why inequality increased in the economy, let us use a very simple demand supply framework through which we can explain how shifts in the labor supply and demand curves could have caused a sizable increase in the wage inequality in the economy. Let us take for example, suppose there are two types of workers in the labor market, one is skilled, another one is unskilled, and let R be the wage ratio between skilled and unskilled workers, and let P the wage ratio of the number of skilled workers to the number of unskilled workers in the economy. Let us take the ratio of these two. One is the wage ratio, R is the wage ratio between the skilled and unskilled workers, where P is the ratio of number of skilled workers to the unskilled workers in the economy. The demand for skilled workers and the wage rate, how it is decided in the labor market. On the x axis, we have taken the relative employment of skilled workers, means P, skilled workers versus unskilled workers. On the y axis, we have taken the relative wage to the skilled workers to unskilled workers. Now, we have considered a downward sloping of the demand function for the skilled workers. Let us assume that the supply of skilled workers is perfectly inelastic at a particular point of time in the economy. So, therefore, it is vertical. So, the supply curve is perfectly inelastic at a particular point of time, and the demand for the skilled workers is downward sloping. So, economy is getting its equilibrium at point A, having a wage rate R 0 and employing P 0 amount of skilled worker in the economy. So, from this simple framework, when we are considering the downward sloping demand curve, this downward sloping demand curve gives the demand for skilled workers relative to the demand for unskilled workers, and it is downward sloping because greater the wage gap between skilled and unskilled workers, which means greater the R, the lower the fraction of skilled workers that employer would like to hire, which means there will be low demand for these skilled workers if the wage gap is high. Therefore, the demand function for these skilled workers is downward sloping. Further, we have considered the supply curve of the skilled worker is perfectly inelastic. So, this assumption is that this demand P is constant, means that a certain fraction of the workforce is skilled regardless of the wage gap between the skilled and unskilled workers. So, even if the gap between these wage rates are 0, there is some amount of workers those who are skilled in the economy. However, in the long run, of course, this assumption is false, because an increase in the reward for the skilled would like to include many more workers to stay in school and acquire more human capital. So, when we consider this, the downward sloping demand function, and at a particular point of time, and we are considering that even if the wage rate gap between this skilled and unskilled workers is 0, still there is some amount of workers are there in the economy, those who are having some skill. So, at a particular point of time, it is P 0, the supply of skilled workers is P 0 and it is perfectly inelastic. We are having the equilibrium at point A. Now, let us say, because of this human capital theory, there is a gap between the wage rate of skilled and unskilled workers, which leads to an increase in the supply of skilled workers in the economy over a period of time. So, if the supply of skilled workers has increased from S0 to S1, now this may lead to a kind of lowering the wage rate for the skilled workers in the economy, keeping the demand constant. If we are holding that there is no change in the circumstances in the demand for these skilled workers, and there is an increase in the supply of workers, then this will lead to reducing the wage gap between the skilled and unskilled workers. So, the economy will move from point A to point B in that case. So, in this context of this simple model, there are only two ways in which the changes in the underlying economic condition would have increased the wage gap between skilled and unskilled workers. First is that the supply curve should shift to the left, indicating for the demand curve to shift to the right, indicating. So, as we see, there has been a sizable increase in the relative number of skilled workers, mostly in the developed countries in the recent decades, which means it has shifted the supply curve outwards to S1. So, in the absence of any other changes in the labor market, this shift in the supply curve had moved the labor market from the equilibrium point A to point B, which has reduced the relative wage rate of skilled workers over the period of time. Skilled workers has increased. It has also been observed in US in last 20 or 30 years of time. Therefore, we cannot explain why there was a rapid rise in the relative wage of skilled workers. In terms of simple model in this figure which you discussed, it must have been happened in that way that relative demand for the skilled workers has also increased. Had it been a situation only there is a shift in the supply of this skilled workers, then this would have been, the wage rate would have been gone down. But it has been observed that the wage rate has gone up, which means there is an increase in the supply of skilled workers. Also, there is an increase in the demand for skilled workers. So, if this demand is sufficiently large and the final equilibrium between the skilled and unskilled workers. So, you can see there has been an increase in the supply of the skilled workers. So, the economy has moved from point A to point, this should have been happened, the economy should have moved from point A to point B, lowering the wage rate for the skilled workers. However, the wage gap between the skilled and unskilled workers over the period of time has increased, which means simultaneously there has been an increase in the demand for these skilled workers. As a result, you can see the economy is at equilibrium at point C, which has increased the wage gap between the skilled and unskilled workers, which has increased the wage rate of skilled workers. So, the demand for skilled workers has outweighed the supply of skilled workers over this period of time, resulting in increase in the wage gap in the economy. So, the supply and demand framework clearly shows that any attempt to understand the rise in the relative wage of skilled workers must identify factors that increase the relative demand for skilled labor. Moreover, this rightward shift in the demand curve must have been sufficiently large to outweigh the impact of increase in the relative supply of skilled workers. In a sense, we can say that the relative supply and demand curves for skilled workers were in a race in last 20-30 years. Both the curves have shifted to right. So, the observed trend in the wage inequality suggests that the demand curve won the race. As a result, the wage for the skilled workers has increased and the wage gap has increased over the period of time. So, up to this point we have analyzed can generate a great deal of income inequality within a particular population and how changes in the structure of the economy can change the wage distribution in significant ways within a very short period of time. Now, let us try to address the question of whether wage inequality in particular generation is transmitted to the next generation. So, whether there is an intergenerational wage inequality exists, or if it exists, whether it declines over a period of time or it increases over a period of time. So, the link between the skills of the parents and children, or more generally you can say the rate of social mobility, is the heart of many of the most hotly discussed policy question in the labor economics. So, let us consider for instance the debate over whether the lack of social mobility in particular segment of society contributes to the creation of an underclass, or the debate over whether the government policies help strengthen the link in the poverty and welfare dependency across generations. So, throughout our discussion, we have assumed that workers invest in their own human capital. Up to this point, whatever we discussed that the workers, they invest on their own human capital. In fact, a large part of our human capital was chosen and funded by our parents. So, it is useful to think of human capital accumulation and the process of accumulation of this human capital in an intergenerational context. Parents care both about their own well-being as well as the well-being of their children. So, as a result, parents will invest in their children's human capital. So, the investment that parents make in their children's human capital help to create the link between the skill of the parents and the skill of their children. So, high income parents will typically invest more in their children, creating a positive correlation between socio-economic outcomes experienced by the parents and the outcomes experienced by the children. There are many studies who have tried to explore this intergenerational transfer of these inequalities. So, many empirical studies have attempted to estimate the relationship between income of the children and income of the parents. So, how they are interrelated and whether the gap between the earning of the parents and the children have increased or decreased over the period of time, which we call intergenerational wage inequality. So, inequality across generations. Now, if you look at this graph, on the x axis we have taken the earnings of the parents, and the y axis we have taken the earnings of the children. And when we have drawn so many regression lines. The regression lines, the slopes are different. If you look at the regression line A, which is a 45-degree slope, which means the slope is 1, and we have drawn a regression line, the slope is 0. So, when we say the regression line is the line A and the slope is 1, what does it mean? An intergenerational correlation, when it is equals to 1, as you can see in the figure, the line A, this implies that if the earnings gap between any two parents, let us say it is $1,000, their children's income will also differ by $1,000. Now, if the correlation were equal to 0.5, which means a $1,000 earning gap between two parents will translate to a $500 earning gap between their children. So, the transform of this gap from one generation to another generation depends on the correlation, the slope. Most of the empirical studies, they find that this intergenerational correlation is less than 1. So, that the earning differentials among any two parents will typically exceed the expected earnings differences which has been found among the children of these two households. So, the possible reduction of the difference in the skill or income across the generation is known as the regression towards mean. Regression towards mean means it is a tendency for the income differences across families to get smaller and smaller over the period of time, as the various families move towards the mean of the income in the population. So, this is a kind of upward social mobility in the income ladder over the generations. So, the phenomena of this regression towards the mean may arise because the parents do not devote their entire wealth to invest in their children's human capital, but rather consume some of it by themselves in the present. So, the regression towards the mean also may occur if the parents encounter a diminishing return when they try to invest in their children human capital. So, the marginal cost of education would then rise very rapidly as the parents try to inject more schooling in their children. So, when they are trying to have more human capital investment in their children, they may find that the marginal cost of education would rise because of the diminishing return to the investment. The parents are facing a diminishing return to the investment. Therefore, they are facing difficult to invest human capital on their children. Finally, the regression towards mean in the income also may arise because there is probably some regression towards the mean in ability. So, it is unlikely that children of exceptionally bright and extraordinary parents will be even brighter. So, it may happen that one generation is having the ability, but the next generation is not having that ability. So, this regression towards the mean may not happen in that way. So, ability plays a significant role, diminishing return plays a significant role, moving towards this regression of mean. So, it is important to note that the closer the intergenerational correlation gets to 0, means the faster regression towards the mean across the generation. In fact, if the intergenerational correlation were equal to 0, when we see that the line is flat and horizontal, it is perfectly elastic, there would be complete regression towards the mean because none of the difference in the parental skill are transmitted to their children. So, as you can see, if it is the slope is 0 and it is flat, which means none of the intergenerational it has been translated to their children. If it is 1, it is high. So, most of the empirical studies, they have found that it lies between 0 to 1. So, the intergenerational coefficient lies between 0 to 1 in most of the empirical studies. Now, how we can interpret this intergenerational correlation coefficients? Recently, if you consider Gary Baker's work in 1986, Gary Baker and Nigel Toms in 1986 in their paper Human Capital and the Rise and Fall of the Families, they have found that intergenerational correlation between the earnings of the father and the children was in order of 0.2. So, what does it mean? It means that if the wage differential between any two parents is in the order of 30%, the wage differential between their children would be expected to be in the order of only 6%, which means 30% multiplied by 0.2. So, if the rate of regression towards the mean were constant over time, the wage differential among the grandchildren would then be only 1.2%, which means 30% multiplied by 0.2 multiplied by 0.2. So, it is a second generation transform regression towards the mean is just by 1.2%. So, an intergenerational correlation of 0.2 therefore implies that there is a great deal of social mobility in the population, because the economic status of the workers in the parental generation would not be a good predictor of the economic status of the grandchildren. However, there are many studies, those who have raised serious doubt about the validity of this conclusion made by Gary Baker and Toms. So, the further studies they argue that the intergenerational correlation is probably much higher, perhaps it is the order of 0.3 to 0.4. So, the problem with the earlier studies and the results is that there is a great deal of error in observed measure of the parental skills. So, when workers are asked about their socio-economic status of their parents, the responses regarding the parental education and earnings are probably not very precise. So, this measurement error weakens the estimation and correlation between skill of the parents and the children. So, it turns out that if we net out the impact of measurement error in the estimation of this intergenerational correlation, the estimated correlation often doubles. So, if the intergenerational correlation were indeed about 0.4, it would imply that a 30% wage gap between two parents translate into a 12% wage gap between the children and a 5% wage gap between their grandchildren. So, skill and income differential among the workers therefore would be the most persistent across generations. So, if we summarize our discussion, the wage dispersion among the workers is transmitted from one generation to the next, because parents care about the well-being of their children and invest in their children's human capital. So, the typical intergenerational correlation shows some regression towards the mean, with the wage gap between any two families narrowing across the generation. So, over the period of time, because of the investment in the human capital of the children by their parents, there is a social upliftment and social mobility happens towards in the ladder of income distribution in the economy. In our next lecture, we will discuss about labor market discrimination. Why and how labor market discriminates, and if this discrimination happens, then what is the labor market outcome in terms of employment and wage. Thank you.